Hello everyone, this is Chris from the World Crypto Network. Thanks for joining me here at Bitcoin in the Beltway in Washington, DC. I am joined here by Liz Reitzig from Nourishing Liberty.
Hi, Chris.
Hello. So we wanted to chat because yesterday I was speaking to Xavier from Permacredits, and I believe you work with Xavier, is that right? But what I wanted to do was continue some of the themes that we were talking about. So we were talking about the idea that the word technology really just...
Hello everyone, this is Chris from the World Crypto Network.
Sorry,
thanks for joining me here.
To turn that off. And we were talking about the fact that actually technology doesn't have to be this tyrannical automation machine that takes away all of our jobs. It actually, the word techne from the ancient Greek means art. And so we were thinking, like, how can the human species become like the steward of nature? If nature is just this kind of raw power and energy, what does the human condition bring to nature? Given that we come from the earth, that we still bury our dead ritualistically, so we are still nature itself. And my thesis was something like we are the stewards of nature.
Yes.
And you're involved in something called distributed food production. So could you tell us what that means?
Well, yeah, basically what I work on is how to get food from producers to communities, to people who want it. And what that looks like, how do we decentralize that entire process so that we're not completely dependent on big corporations for our food and centralized governance who are going to criminalize farmers for peacefully feeding their communities. And I love that you brought up technology, because there's ways to marry modern technology with ancient farming practices. And there's like for example, the electric fencing. I mean, what we can do with that is we can take and mimic nature. So in nature, animals have migratory patterns, especially like the grazing herbivores. And they would migrate along vast plains, but in huge herds. So they would only stay in one area for a short time, but there would be hundreds of them packed into this one area. And so something like electric fences and fencing allows us to mimic that pattern, where first in a field, in a farming field, you would have a herd of cows or sheep or whatever animal you're raising that's grazing, followed by the chickens a couple days later. And then they go through and they scratch through all the manure, they eat the bugs out of it, so that's insect control, and they add their own manure, which adds nitrogen to the soil.
Fantastic. So you're creating like a virtuous spiral.
Exactly,
works
and
in equilibrium.
It mimics nature, but some of the modern technology allows us to kind of use our human stewardship, as you were calling it, to go ahead and mimic nature and create the sustainability and actually restore a lot of our natural environment.
So why aren't we doing that already? Why is agriculture such it's the biggest industry in the world, but only just above pharmaceuticals? Pharmaceuticals are the second largest.
Well, so why don't we do it? It's because agriculture has been industrialized, and there are people who are going back to this stewardship kind of agriculture. Joel Salatin is a great example, and there's people who are implementing that kind of stewardship across the world. Permaculture, what Permacredits is based on, is an example of how people are doing that on every level. So from backyard or front yard gardening to ranching, and people are utilizing the principles of permaculture and stewardship to produce food.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And so what real impacts has that had so far? Like, can you give us a case study of where that's actually worked?
Yeah, there's lots of examples. Joel Salatin's farm in Swoop, Virginia is a great example. He's a very public figure, easy to look up, easy to follow. Then Alan Savory, he's a conservationist, and he's done extensive research, environmentalist and conservationist, where he was looking at what is the impact and what is the cost of animals grazing. And originally his hypothesis was that we need fewer animals in one place grazing. So he actually worked on a project where they depopulated herds and herds of elephants in Africa, which is his heartbreak now, because he's finding that what they needed was to stack more of those grazing animals in one place to produce the kind of restoring the soil, getting the nutrients back into the soil. And what we get from practices like that is we get a win-win-win situation where people are winning, they're getting the nutrients that they need in their food, it's coming through the soil. The animals are actually getting to live their natural lives until, in some cases, until they're slaughtered, otherwise until they die. And what it does for our environment and our soils is it restores our soils, it restores balance to our environment.
What does it do to the shareholder of the big multinational corporation that just wants to speed this whole process up by using fertilizers, by using like GMOs, that kind of thing? Like, that doesn't hurt the bottom line. It's not going to scale. You're not going to be able to control like a worldwide food production.
Well, and to me, that's the appeal. Like,
right.
why should a very small group of people be controlling a worldwide food source?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that to me is scary. And what we do need is this decentralization. We need the fact that farmers, individual farmers and individual members of communities are taking responsibility for food production and for feeding their communities peacefully. And how it affects the shareholders, I'm not concerned about that. I think that what that kind of farming model is contributing to the economy in other kinds of value is far superior to shareholders' bottom line, where they're not getting quality of life out of that.
So what I'd really like to see is a situation where I could buy my coffee beans directly off the farmer in Uganda with Bitcoins or Feathercoins or whatever currency I chose. And I don't see why it's so difficult to set up like an eBay-style marketplace for worldwide food producers. We saw this already, like in places like Hong Kong. The fishermen in the Hong Kong area used to, like, the mortality rate was really high because they didn't have access to information. They didn't have mobile phones or the internet. But as soon as like a local social entrepreneurial group gave them mobile phones, all of a sudden like the death rate went right down. They also had price control now because they weren't able to be manipulated down on the price because they could see the market price. So they were the prime market and the retail market. Like the big, you have Walmart in the UK. We have like Tesco's and Waitrose and all these big supermarkets, and they have this huge purchasing power with the farmers. So they can drill down, they can get the farmers to go down the price. What that's done in the UK is it's made farming a zero profit game. So now farmers start to do things like they build on the land, they build houses, luxury homes, they build like a commercial, section, and technically that's greenbelt area, like then, but they get away with it. Because somehow they have to make ends meet, but they still need to be able to eat and sleep and so on. So what it sounds like you're talking about is open source practices for how to get the most. So I find some land here, and by using a resource of some kind, I don't quite know what that is yet. Is there somewhere I can read and learn how to do this, that I can then just cultivate that land? I can educate myself and become an expert.
Yes, absolutely. And thankful for the internet, we can have that access to that information at our fingertips all the time. But there's also amazing books written by the founders of permaculture and the founders of this kind of grass-intensive farming. Because what the farmers call themselves is they're not cattle farmers or sheep farmers. They call themselves grass farmers because what they're doing is they're cultivating the grass that is being turned into food.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I see that. And how far does this food usually go? Is it usually to stay within the community locally?
Well, see, the nice thing, what you just mentioned, is you want to be able to use Bitcoin to buy coffee directly from the farmer. So in the decentralization of food production, what we can do is we can contract directly with farmers on whatever scale that looks like. For me, I work with local farmers, and I actually work with them on bringing raw milk across state lines, which is illegal here in the States. And in other places, it can be community-based or it can be world-based, and this is how Bitcoin comes into play, and it offers such a great technological tool for these farmers, because where some products really are local products, like milk. You're not going to put raw, fresh milk on a ship and transport it. But coffee beans, yes. And so it opens up that entire, it opens up for these individual farmers a worldwide marketplace rather than just a community. But it's still direct. So it's peer-to-peer, just like.
So what I really love about this is you're taking out the middleman. Like, don't pay the middleman. And that's what a lot of these big globalized corporations have become. They've actually become offshoring companies, because if you think about it, like one of the projects that I work on in Hull, a lot of the money in a small town in northern England gets siphoned out by all these international corporations. So you get big companies like Sainsbury's, obviously Amazon and Starbucks they set up shop in these villages, and all of the earnings, all the profits go offshore because they don't want to pay any tax.
Yeah.
And they always pay their staff the minimum amount they can get away with, whatever the labor market lets them get away with. And they try to get as much as they can for as little in return as possible. But then in the meantime, the people locally end up getting absolutely drained. And they can always move somewhere else. There are plenty more golden geese they can.
Right. And whether we're looking at fiat dollars or Bitcoin, when you have the decentralization of the food production and the peer-to-peer transactions, you are revitalizing local economies. Because let me just give you one example. The price of milk is controlled here. So farmers who are selling to Land O'Lakes or whatever co-op they're selling to, they're getting a fixed price per hundredweight. And that's way lower than what you're paying at the grocery store for the milk. And when I contract directly with a farmer in Pennsylvania for a gallon of milk, every penny of that is going to him.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and so what that means is that not only is he able to make an actual living farming, not have to have an off-farm job as well to support his farming hobby, but it means that he's then able to keep spreading that money in his local rural economy. So this decentralization of the food production and the peer-to-peer transactions, it's such a win-win-win because you get the environmental conservation that where farmers can stay on the land, they can revitalize the soils. Then you get this good, healthy transaction for beneficial food, and you get this. There's so much value here. And when I go directly to a farmer, I mean, I love my farmer. Like I give him a hug, and it's great. There's that value added, and then there's the value of like knowing that you're supporting revitalizing rural economies. And it's just got so much win all around.
Now let's move this into markets. I'm a big fan of Osaka, Japan, 17th century, the invention of the forward contract. And what we have here is a situation where a farmer isn't sure whether or not he can afford to take the risk on the weather. He doesn't know whether or not he should grow his crop for the next season. And enter the speculator who says, look, I understand your business, I understand the risks involved, and I'm willing to buy that grain off of you for an agreed price in the future. And that thereby reduces your risk because on the understanding that everyone benefits. Right. And even when these contracts fail, like even if the weather did go bad, what would happen is these forward contracts would just often be renegotiated. Actually, Pamela Morgan and Powered Law was talking about this yesterday. I talked about it this morning on my show. And she talks about making justice more conversational. It becomes a never-ending dialogue that you're not supposed to just say, all right, I'll just sign this because what I really want to do is get the product or whatever, and I don't care what I'm binding myself to, because all that does is forms an unstable agreement. My thesis is part of the reason we're in this global financial crisis is because the forward turned into a futures contract. It became, particularly with the Chicago Futures Exchange, was everything became electronic. And when everything becomes electronic, people just look like numbers to you. They don't look personal anymore. And there's nothing more impersonal than a number, right? Like when you have a barcode and all of that. And I think what's happened is it's become okay for us to treat each other badly so long as we don't have to look each other in the eye. So now you have these like sovereign wealth funds going around the world, pumping up markets, blowing bubbles around the world by investing in the local community, and then there's selling at the high and then moving on to something else. And there's plenty of other places they can go around. But in the meantime, it screws over the local economy. I'm not suggesting I've got a solution for this. I'm just trying to diagnose the problem. I think what's happened is we've sleptwalked our way into this. I don't think it's deliberate. I don't think like Ada Lovelace or Charles Babbage, or like actually if you think about it, the computer comes from textiles, the modern binary computer. The logic comes from the Jacquard loop. That was the first binary device that had an on-off, because everything else in our world doesn't have an on-off switch. Like all of this technology, and this is technology, and the table is technology, this is all, it degrades gracefully over time. Binary is like either works or it doesn't. I think what happened was we had the world wars in the 20th century, and we just sleptwalked our way into this hyper-connected world, and we haven't really thought about why we're doing this, like what's motivating us, what's behind this. And I don't understand, because if we're not careful, we are going to end up in a world where it's perfect. Like we see this in Bitcoin all the time, where people just go onto the exchange and they just pump and dump all day, and they're not thinking about the other human being that's sitting on the other side. And usually the only person that wins is the middleman. It's the exchange that makes the fees on every trade. So we do that with food. Like Robert Harrison Stanford University. He's got this wonderful show on like vegetarianism or veganism, and he says like the dreadful thing about animals and the way we treat them is that we force them into life just so that we can force them into death, that they only live for us. And that got me. Now I actually want to be a vegetarian again. Like, unless that animal has just lived a life they would have lived anyway, that was a natural life, then I kind of don't feel so good about it. So now I tend to kind of stay away from it. So I've said a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot to touch on. But what I'm really present to is your talk about what I'm going to interpret as connection. And that's the human-to-human connection, and it's also the human-to-animal connection, and it's also the human-to-earth connection, for lack of a better term. And I know that sounds like
New Age.
Yes, but what I mean is the real, tangible, physical connection of going and digging in the soil and putting a seed in and watching it grow, and the empowerment that comes from that. And then, like, for example, I mean, I grow a garden. I love my garden. I love thinking about it in January and then planting the seeds, and I'm usually a little like, I anticipate it and plant them a little bit too soon sometimes. And I did that this year, where I started a lot inside, but then I already also direct sowed just before the last frost. So then I had this couple of weeks of, oh no, are they going to come up? And then replanting everything and going through that couple of weeks of, did I do everything right? And that mothering feeling. And then everything's coming up, and it's great, and it's wonderful, and I get to watch it all grow. And then my brother was in town, who's very dear to me, and I prepared a meal for him from my garden. And it's that kind of real, tangible connection where it keeps me going. And I think you're commenting on that as well, where you see like this is what community is, and this is what it looks like. And when you take that and dehumanize it, like, you lose that connection very much.
So maybe then the solution could be something like, it's a cultural change that we need to find different, like at the moment I'm penalized for buying healthy food because most people don't.
And also because the unhealthy food is heavily subsidized. So it looks like our healthy options are more expensive. But what I would encourage you to look at, and everybody really, is the other value sets that are going into all of these choices, that are going into our decisions, because it's not just an exchange of currency, whether that currency is in fiat or Bitcoin. There's a lot of other exchanges that are going on there that lead to some of that connection, that add value to our lives. Whether it be,
such as, like,
well, for example, like the food that I shared with my brother, like that's a relationship. That's we could call it social capital, right? Where we're sharing this meal, and I can do that with anybody. Like, prepare them a meal of stuff that I've grown, and then we have an exchange there that adds a different kind of value to my life and a kind of value to their life that's not monetary based. And in the same way, like, think of it as maybe more of a barter system, where you might be exchanging your labor for some information, for example. And that
reputation.
Is yes, and that's alive and well within the whole sustainable farming communities and the permaculture communities, where there's a lot of this exchange for labor for intellectual capital, or spiritual capital, that those connections with other people, social capital. There's the 8 forms of capital that Ethan Rowland elaborates on, and that's a component of permaculture. And I'm finding that I can't learn enough about it right now. Like, I just want to absorb it all and understand it all. And I think that they're all there with Bitcoin and with the decentralization of any currency.
Yeah, I think part of the problem, like you mentioned, the monetary aspect, I would disagree just on that syntactically, because I think that money is an intangible thing. I think people put money into their reputation, they put money into their land, they put money into gold, food, whatever, but it's not something you can touch. And I think what's happened is that we have overestimated the things that we can measure at the expense of the things that we can't, and that's what you're getting to. You're getting to the things that we can't measure, like the reputation, like the connection, like the surprise. And really what the blockchain does, like if we look at it as a distributed database, is what I encourage everyone to do every time I do one of these videos, is stop looking at it as money. Like the only reason people decided it was money was because they thought someone else would. But no one has really taken the time to delve deep into what this is. I might be talking to Mike Maloney later on video. We had an informal chat yesterday, and I love his videos because he actually helps people to understand the distinction between currency and money. Currency is just anything that can flow. It's portable, divisible, and fungible. Yeah. But it doesn't become money until it holds its value, because no one's going to want to invest their money into something that's going to lose its value before they expect to spend it on whatever future plans that they have.
Right.
And so if we're talking about like a global, some kind of synchronized shift in values, where we all somewhat simultaneously agree no longer to buy food from these global corporations, it might not even be something that we have to do, like we don't have to manipulate it, we don't have to market this. It might be something the public actually want to do anyway, because they may just be fed up with the way they're being treated. I mean, food historically is unprecedentedly cheap right now. Like people, like hundreds of years ago, people would spend 80% of their income on their food. But we've had for a long time in the late 20th century to today, very, very cheap food in the West. But now you are seeing developing countries all over the world that have access to the internet. They can see our lifestyles and they want that too. And so now that's driving up fuel costs, which thus drives up food, because food needs to be transported. But if you're talking about a world where food is grown locally and people start to eat seasonally instead of like, you know, buying their raspberries in the winter and all that kind of thing.
They have a kind of a different, I don't want to say different, but something more to the value system than just how much is that apple.
Right.
There's something more going on there. Where is it grown? What kind of quality of life is the farmer getting who's growing this food? What is the growing of this particular food? What is it doing to our entire ecosystem? Yes, absolutely.
But we're a culture that's obsessed with image rather than appearance. Right? Because image is divorced from what goes on behind it and what propagates up to give it what it is. An image can be entirely separate. And I think what happens is we've created a culture that is very, very good at presenting images on the outside which completely betray the truth underneath. And we're happy with that lie, like we have done. Like, look at what the advertising industry is. Right? This is basically about giving recommendations to people that they don't even trust, and then making money out of that, telling people what to buy. And the underlying assumption there is that the consumer can't be trusted with their purchasing habits. They have to be told what to do. Right, that I can't just make an educated decision for myself. Right. And I feel like, you know, we had that talk with Michelle Seven earlier. Michelle gave a talk, and I think I at least came to the conclusion that the real enemy wasn't even the government. It was the apathetic public that give them that power in the first place. Like if people just chose to be more responsible for themselves and their own education and their learning, we wouldn't have a lot of these situations. Right. And maybe what all these meetups are people going back to school and they're coming like together.
And you touch on a really good point, and it's pivotal to the shift in food production. People do have to care where their food is coming from. They have to care how the land is being treated, how the animals are being treated, and how the people are being treated. Because farmers are people too, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier, you were talking about the futures contracts and all of that. And there's some models in farming, like the CSA model, community supported agriculture, where it's very similar to that, but it's like if you and I, we want a produce share for the season, we'll find a farmer. We can contract with a farmer, and we'll say, we're gonna each buy a share of your farm, and you know there can be hundreds of shares in one farm, and then everybody who has a share, they divide whatever that farm produces for that season. But we've bought into the labor of the farmer. We've bought into their risk. Because what if it is a really dry season and not everything grows? Then we're saying it's worth it to us for you to stay on the farm. That we're gonna take the risk with you. You're not alone in this.
Yeah.
And then it's also about taking responsibility for some of our own food production, but getting something, we get value out of that. Like when people start to produce some of their own food, they get incredible value out of that. It increases their quality of life.
This actually reminds me of something that Hobbes said in Leviathan. He said, like, if society really believed in God, we wouldn't need contracts anymore, because we'd all just go around keeping our promises. Like, part of the reason we got into this mess is because we gave up hope on the future. I've got this theory that actually God, what we call God, is actually just the future. It's just the future generations looking back at us and us hypothesizing and predicting what that would be like and what sort of views they would form of us. Because we are at the mercy of the people that that we came after, our ancestors,
Right,
because they give us all of this. We're brought into a world with technology, with language, with buildings that we had no say over. But then also we're endowed with that too. And I feel like what's happened now is that as soon as you're born, you're pushed into school, you're pushed into a mode of production as quickly as possible. And you're tested every step of the way. And it's almost like in quantum mechanics, this idea of the quantum Zeno effect, like if you keep, in neuropsychology, that if you keep testing the state of something, it never changes. And this is what's happening in school now, is they're so obsessed with the quantification of the student. They have to keep measuring and measuring and measuring. And they don't really learn anything, they're just learning how to be taught. They're not learning how to learn. And so they're not learning to take responsibility for themselves. You know, the underlying assumption of an examiner is that, look, there is this person that knows everything. The world is knowable. And if only you know what the examiner knows, then you'll be passed. You'll get these economic tokens, money, called grades, and you'll be able to take them straight to the bank and cash out. But then as a result, we end up living these very passive existences where we're sitting with our TV dinner in front of, you know, some...
Exactly. High standard of living, low quality of life.
Well put.
Yes.
Exactly. So tell us a little bit about your blog, Nourishing Liberty. How does that play into all of this?
So my focus is food is the foundation for freedom. And so I go into a lot of the current politics and policies around food and food choice, why they're there, what we can do about them. I talk a lot about non-compliance. I'm a big believer in non-compliance and the strength that gives us, and in a very peaceful way. So like Gandhi says that non-violence is the greatest force known to mankind. It is mightier than the mightiest weapon of destruction devised by the ingenuity of man. And that's kind of my core belief system in all of this, that really like our peaceful non-compliance is our greatest tool. And whether it comes to food or speech or Bitcoin, whatever's going on, that our peace non-cooperation, that's our greatest tool. And I go into some of the farmers who have not complied with some of the things that turn them into criminals for feeding their communities, and then how people support them, what that looks like, and how we can the existing reality create a new one.
Yeah, that's really powerful. But that power is only there, isn't it, if everyone does it?
No.
Or enough people do.
I think it's there. You were referencing Michelle's talk, and she spoke about the personal comes from saying no. And that we do that, we show other people that happen. It's doable, and that we survive it.
Yeah.
And just individual, more people, yes, like obviously it would be great if it was widely adopted, but individually, us can do it, and any of us can show others how to. And some of our farmers have led incredible examples of non-compliance with feeding their communities.
Well, that's really great. Yeah. So, be sure, and if you're going to be there, you won't be there. But I do think it's a little bit. How can people in any of the projects that you're working on?
For Legal Defense Fund to put your toe in the water that fully. Check out farmmatch.com, a website to connect people to local sources of food. Permedits.com, of course, because that's where the future of this, and it's the best crypto. And read the blog.
And what's your Twitter?
It's at Nourish Liberty.
Lovely. I'll make sure I play for everyone who's there, and follow us on @WorldCryptoNet on Twitter to stay up to date for more. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris.